The UK's economy, which was the sixth biggest in the world, entirely collapsed on September 26. At the moment, the nation is on the approach of a very sinister disaster. How is this possible? The UK was one of the world's greatest economies just 15 years ago, but the nation is currently experiencing a dire economic crisis. The government is currently preparing police for a breakdown in public order brought on by this economic catastrophe as the country's debt has doubled, winter blackouts are approaching, the currency is collapsing, and now 3/4 of British pubs risk permanent closure. The new UK government's intention to borrow further billions served as the catalyst for all of this, sending the market is out of control. The UK is undoubtedly feeling the effects of this recession as the country's inflation rates have increased by over 10% this year, the highest in over 40 years, and on top of that the UK is the only G7 country to never recover economically from COVID. Please subscribe and read more about this, as there are rumors that major banks like Deutsche Bank and Morgan Stanley may now also be on the verge of collapse. With the value of the pound falling to its lowest level ever versus the dollar and the cost of living rising due to the energy crisis, UK citizens lost 5% of their entire savings in a single day. The conflict with Russia, Brexit, and frequent changes of power, the timing of a crisis, increasing debt from the virus, skyrocketing property prices, and rising crime rates couldn't be worse. Therefore, the issue is how such a catastrophe could have occurred and what lies ahead for the UK. We must first examine the events that have occurred in the UK during the past 10 years in order to comprehend what will happen future. For example, if you look at 2007, you would notice that from 1996 to 2010 the UK's economic growth was stronger than any other G7 country. However, while everything was perfect during this time, this would all change during the 2008 financial crash, and since the crash the UK's economy seemed to be heading for disaster. An LNG investment strategist named James Carrick predicted the UK's GDP would steadily grow by 3% a year, and in the same year the pound was worth $2. The UK prior to the recession, the country's debt stood at 41.5% of GDP. 5 years later, it doubled at 83.2%, and by 2022, it had reached 98.6%. As a result, high taxes and significant public service cuts were implemented as the UK entered an austerity period, which, put simply, meant that public funding for the police, healthcare, and other services would be drastically reduced while taxes were raised. Has been gradually less and less disposable income for the average Brit, and with a large influx of immigrants and oligarchs purchasing homes. It wouldn't take long for home ownership to be a right reserved only for the wealthy, causing economic phenomena with things like poor doors becoming more and more common in London and people even renting out their own cupboards under the stairs for £500 a month. These were the kinds of things that caused the UK to be very resented. What this will do to you: this country is poorer and life is harder for everyone if you have a mortgage, a job, or you purchase goods and services. However, while this economic situation was bad, it was nothing compared to what the UK is currently going through, because the 2008 crash actually had similar effects to all other G7 countries. What made the UK unique, however, were the actions that would come after this process, which would eventually lead to the situation we're in today because it was this trade agreements overseas. The only drawback was that it would take time to put these more affordable trade agreements in place, making the entire UK economy much more volatile if anything were to change the current economic climate. Nevertheless, it appeared that the UK's continued strength in the global economy would eventually make up for the initial loss from leaving the EU. However, by 2018, economists had already determined that under the Free Trade Agreement, the UK would experience a loss. Little did anyone know what was just around the corner. The coronavirus is the biggest threat this country has faced in decades. Throughout the world, people are witnessing the devastating effects of this invisible killer. In 2020, the entire market collapsed seemingly overnight. Countries were now focusing on keeping themselves afloat as much as possible. In addition to the restrictions placed internationally, the UK also implemented many domestic covert precautions, all of which negatively compounded the country's already stagnant economy. Measures like social distancing. The result was a disaster in the form of an unprecedented drop in the once sky-high GDP of the UK over the course of the first few months of the pandemic. The country's GDP crashed by nearly 20%, a new record that the UK now regrettably holds. However, once again, These effects were similar to other countries in G7. All of the West was facing the same issues. What other countries weren't facing with the never-ending political scandals that would tend the UK's reputation was government paying for businesses to stay open, all while nobody was spending any of their money and everyone was also locked up in the houses for fear of the virus. This led to one of the most significant recessions that the nation has ever seen. The time has come for us all to do more, so starting this evening I must give the British people a very simple instruction: you must stay at home. About a year after the pandemic's initial phase, dozens of photos were leaked showing Johnson drinking and hanging out with his friends and other politicians. Once the photos went public, it would become one of the main reasons for Johnson's death. Britain is still the only one in the G7 that has not fully recovered from the effects of the coronavirus, and due to the UK economy's fragility, foreign investors have left the country, joining France. Trust me when I say that this is nothing compared to what's been happening in the last year, because almost right after the country opened up again it would be served with a new fresh crisis. But before we continue, I want to talk to you about our video sponsor Masterworks. What if this turmoil culminated with the news that terrified markets? It was unthinkable just 5 years ago that China would overtake the UK in terms of foreign investments. Everybody was left wondering, wait, I'm diversified, why is my portfolio still getting wiped out? Because, according to the biggest fans in the world, they're not diversified in the right way. See. Of course, with this announcement nearly every major stock went down, bringing the S&P 500's losses to around 9 for that month and over 23 for the year. The conventional Stockholm approach won't be enough to keep investors afloat, according to a frightening report from Goldman Sachs last week. The general belief is that the perfect stock allocation has decreased from 60 to approximately 45, since there have already been over 20 declines this year alone. What then do they propose? That you use that difference to invest in genuine assets like the arts in order to recover your stolen earnings. Goldman claims that even in these circumstances, where danger indicates that inflation last reached this level, your buying power may be protected. How do you invest in art? Well, Masterworks is a unique platform that allows you to invest in contemporary arts by like Picasso and Banksy. You see, when they set a painting you're invested in, you see a share of the potential profits. So far, Masterworks has had 6 exits for an average net return of 29 to investors. Some of you have used it. High contemporary art appreciated more than real estate and even gold at an average of 33 per year. As you can see, covert pressure had reduced energy supplies, which combined with already exorbitant prices and, as if that weren't enough, Putin's invasion of Ukraine caused all of the oil and gas that Russia used to sell to the EU to disappear almost immediately. As a result, as the supply dropped sharply, the demand rose to make up for it, driving up energy prices to the point where most people were paying an additional £1,570 a year on their energy bills. They will have enough money to attack homes. Even though this has been a global crisis, the UK has been particularly hard hit. The UK depends on gas for 50% of its electricity, and since Putin shut off the gas pipes, the cost of gas has only increased. On the other hand, even though the 5 largest companies have made a combined $50 billion during the crisis, the UK firm BP saw its profits triple from April to June alone. To put things in perspective, there are about 35,000 pubs nationwide, tens of thousands of jobs have been lost, and English towns and villages have been decimated. However, with Boris Johnson on the verge of leaving, there was a glimmer of hope that the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, might be able to turn things around or have a new plan. However, it wouldn't be long after Liz Truss took office before the entire house of cards came tumbling down, because during the Tory For the taxpayer, this plan only really works on paper, because all the savings that were supposed to be generated for the UK actually ended up costing the nation more than £100 billion, and since the government doesn't have this kind of spending money on hand, the plan will only really work on paper to save families around £1,000 per year and completely numb this energy crisis. Within 40 years, food prices will climb at the quickest rate. The situation has gotten so terrible that essential vegetables are even in limited supply. Shortly after this, the UK government unveiled another seemingly sensible economic plan, the biggest tax reduction the nation has seen since 1972. The so-called mini-budget was anything but small. It included plans to abolish the 45% additional tax on income over £150,000 and lower the basic income tax rate by £170 per person annually. This would result in a savings of almost £3,000 per year for someone making £200,000 per year. In general, these tax cuts were wildly unpopular. These were the only adjustments that seemed to favor the extremely affluent, since the rich would profit 2 times more than the poor. However, where was all this money coming from, and how could the UK afford to not increase tax when it was going through a cost of living crisis, an energy crisis, mountains of debt, mounting inflation, and being the only G7 country to still not recover from COVID? I mean, all of these proposed cuts would cost over £45 billion, and at the same time the UK's public services would be put at risk. The cap on banker bonuses was also removed along with the planned increase in corporation tax. More of their disposable income was being given to the government, but economists demonstrated that this wouldn't be enough to make up for the billions in taxes that wouldn't be collected. Instead, the government had to borrow money, which bothered some people because the mini-budget failed to consider the impact that the UK's massive debt would have on the country or what it would mean for other countries. This is about to get tough, so bear with me. One of the main issues that investors throughout the world faced with planning was due to the investing strategy employed by pension funds in the UK. Pension funds in the UK invest a lot in gilts, which are a type of government bond that lends the government money with interest. To protect themselves from falling interest rates on these types of investments, pension funds put up collateral. This means that pension funds must pay liquid assets, usually cash, to offset their losses. Usually, however, this isn't a problem because gilts are generally safe investments and their prices aren't volatile. Pension funds had to quickly put up a lot of collateral after the mini-budget was announced because the price of these skills dropped significantly. The Bank of England has stated that it will purchase as many long-dated government bonds as necessary between now and October 14 in an effort to stabilize financial markets. They were short on liquid currency, so they had to sell their own gilts to make up the difference, which caused the price to plummet even more. This was the start of what is known as a doom cycle because as more gilts were sold, more collateral had to be put up. To illustrate how serious this was, top economists predicted that these pension funds would have had to pay as much as £550 billion in collateral if gilt prices continued to fall. To be clear, if this occurred, it would have meant that 50% of private savings would have vanished like that. To stop this disastrous cycle, the Bank of England had to immediately step in and bought. The IMF even advised the UK government to control inflation in order to prevent total economic collapse. The markets weren't idle on their fares either, as everyone began selling the pound in anticipation of it rising in value. As more and more people sold their pounds, however, its value dropped further and further until by the end of the day the pound had hit a record low against the dollar only being. The UK is in an economic disaster, and the public's reactions to these measures were just as explosive as the market reactions. People were so outraged that the government actually had to reverse course on its proposed tax cuts for the ultra-rich. This occurred just a few weeks after Liz Truss became Prime Minister. Mohamed Al-Arian, who formerly oversaw the largest bond fund in the world, and a hedge fund manager, the central bank's governor, Andrew Bailey, claimed they will not hesitate in raising rates by as much as necessary. Now what this means is that borrowing will become more difficult for businesses and regular people. Mortgage lenders have pulled 40 of their available mortgages from the market as a result, making it nearly impossible for millennia to purchase a home. An analysis now predicts that the Bank of England will raise borrowing costs to 6% next year. As the country enters this economic collapse, the UK's public services are now under tremendous strain. At the same time, the workforce has shown that they are willing to strike in large numbers. A major London tube strike is currently taking place and will last until Tuesday morning local time. The London Underground is advising people not to travel if they are unable to pay their fare. According to remarks from Eurasia Analysis, this issue will only worsen. Truss and quarantine are currently experiencing a severe economic crisis as the world's financial markets wait for them to implement policy changes that they and the Conservative Party would find objectionable. However, while the UK is stuck in the mud, This entire crisis is just a part of a much wider recession that's currently taking place in both the UK and across the world due to the disruptions from COVID, the Ukraine war, big banks collapsing internationally, and China's economy crumbling to maintain what made Britain so successful. It should be obvious to everyone that our increasingly unequal economic system and neoliberal political trajectory will not be enough. The cultural, social, and political richness that made the UK a beacon of excellence is now just a distant memory, and the world is finally realizing the ugly truth. The veil is being lifted, which is why the World Economic Forum's billionaires, hostile governments, and multi-trillion-dollar investment firms are waiting to seize control, because a bankrupt economy means less expensive investments, a more vulnerable populace, and a fertile environment for economic dominance, which is why the elites are currently licking their lips. When it comes down to it, when the entire house of cards collapses, people will only realize how screwed we really are. If you like this video and want to see more contentious videos, like and subscribe. The UK is just one example of what's coming to everyone. Everyone who is struggling with an economic and political system has given up on them. The complexity of the economic collapse hides the seriousness of the situation.